What's up, everyone? This is the Next Day Podcast, episode 80 with Mikel, and
And Tanyka.
where we have conversations on different topics. This month is Women's History Month, and we're
Mm-hmm.
a special episode for that. What do
Yep.
we have for this episode, Tanyka?
So just to preface, we're doing a series. So like we do like with Black History Month, we're doing a series. So we're doing a bunch of different episodes this month. So the first one we're doing is we're talking about Eliza Schuyler, who is, as we know, was Alexander Hamilton's wife. I want to focus on her because I think she's incredible. And we're also going to be talking about Elma Sands. Okay, sorry guys, I had a little bit of a cough attack there, but yeah, so we're going to be talking about Elma Sands, who was the very first murder trial of all of America. It was in 1800, but I think with her, it kind of just she fascinates me. The case fascinates me. How they handled the case fascinates me, and I think like I want to talk about her. So that's what we're going to be doing with this
Mm,
episode.
mm,
But yeah. So before we do, because we are recording this episode, or this episode's coming out after your trek through a million centimeters of snow. How
mhm.
did that go?
It went well. It
Did you
was,
manage to get
it,
there in one
it was,
piece?
it was tiring, actually,
Yeah.
because and a lot of snow, and I had to come back home and shovel. So,
Mm,
yeah, pretty good movie. Captain America,
yeah.
A New World. If you guys haven't seen it, it's a good movie. Go see it in theaters. And yeah, yeah,
Okay. Well, was it worth the trek?
it was a good. Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, it's a good. Like I said, it's a good movie, and it was worth it was worth the going through, and through that snow. So
1,000 centimeters of snow.
yeah, yeah, a lot of snow. It, crazy, like t even taller than me. So yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well,
What did you do? Like basically, like did you went through the snow? Did snow angels?
no.
Did you shovel or no?
My grandfather actually hired
Oh.
someone um to shovel both ours and his. Um they came at like 4:30 in the morning after yesterday's snowfall. They're supposed to come after like at 6 o'clock to shovel today's snow,
Mm-hmm.
but they haven't shown up yet. And just to preface, we're recording this well past 6 p.m. and they still haven't shown up. Um, but our deck, like like the deck in my house at the back of like dining room,
Mm-hmm.
the snow on the deck right now is actually like I'm worried, is the deck gonna like collapse or something? There's so much snow sitting on the deck right now. It's ridiculous. I haven't seen anything like it in a long time. So it's a good idea of how much snowfall we've gotten, at least in February. It's
Right.
ridiculous. It's
Yeah.
so
No.
high.
Yeah. It is. It is.
But
I, yeah.
anyway,
Mhm.
enough about snow.
Yeah.
Let's talk Eliza Schuyler. Now, again, for those people who do know or don't know Eliza Schuyler, we see her in Hamilton. And again, my takeaway from Hamilton is like, you think it's about Alexander Hamilton, but I really think it's so much more than that. I think it's very much about Eliza Schuyler and the she's the reason we know so much.
Hmm.
And I think that's incredible. And I think she's incredible.
Hmm.
And that's why we're going to talk about her. So,
Okay. All right.
long suffering yet intensely loyal Elizabeth Hamilton, or Schuyler, buried her sister, her eldest son, her husband, and her father in the space of 3 years.
Hmm.
I don't know many people who
Excuse me.
could like handle that.
Hmm.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
She would spend much of her long widowhood working to secure Hamilton's place in American history. So
Mm.
Elizabeth Schuyler was born on August 7th, 1757 in Albany, New York,
Hmm.
daughter of wealthy landowner and Revolutionary War General Philip Schuyler.
Hmm.
Almost none of the Elizabeth almost none of Elizabeth's own correspondence has survived.
Hmm.
Rumor has it that she might have maybe destroyed any letters, especially between her and Alexander Hamilton. That is what they portray in the Broadway show anyways. We'll never know. But um her personality is gleaned largely from the impressions of others. Good-natured, though somewhat serious, she was at ease in the outdoors and devout in her Christian faith. A dutiful daughter, she eschewed the elopements chosen by three of her sisters and instead conducted a traditional, if whirlwind, courtship with the dashing young age she found at George Washington's headquarters in February 1780. They had met briefly a few years before, which I think I had mentioned briefly last year. But now Alexander Hamilton was smitten, a quote unquote gone man, in the words of another. um, another aide saying, quote, "I meet you in every dream," Hamilton wrote in one of his spooning letters, and quote, "and when I wake, I cannot close my eyes for ruminating on your sweetness." What a charmer. In a joking letter to a fellow aide, he sounded more dispassionate, though. He said, quote, "though not a genius, excuse you, she has good sense enough to be agreeable, ew, and though not a beauty, she's beautiful. She has fine black eyes, is rather handsome, and has every other requisite of the exterior to make a lover happy. Gross. Listen, Lin-Manuel Miranda might portray Alexander Hamilton as some kind of hero. That he is not. I think
Wow.
he's an asshole, personally.
Yeah, it sounds like he is.
Yeah. Not to say that he deserved to be killed. No one deserves that.
Hmm. Hmm.
But he's an ass. So yeah, she could have done better. Anyways, Alexander and Elizabeth, he called her Eliza or Betsy, were married at the Schuyler home on December 14th of that same year, so 1780, and Hamilton was warmly received into the family. He had
Mm.
particularly fond dealings with Philip Schuyler and Elizabeth's eldest sister, which, if you've seen the show, would know, Angelica, a beautiful and charming woman. In one letter, as we know, maybe
Mm.
not Mikel, but Angelica told Elizabeth that she loved Hamilton, saying, quote, "very much, and if you were as generous as the old Romans, you would lend him to me for a little while."
Mm.
Jesus.
Mm. Wow.
No, you can't have my man. What are you talking about?
Mhm.
They're, again, portrayed in the Broadway show. I think there is some truth to it. There was a weird relationship that formed between Alexander Hamilton and Angelica Schuyler. So I don't know. I don't think he necessarily had an affair with her sister. He, as we know, we'll talk about later, he does have an affair with someone, but not his sister. Her sister, I mean. But yeah, it's weird.
Mm.
It's weird.
Yeah.
Inappropriate.
Yeah, it is.
Whether Elizabeth received this as sisterly banter or something more serious
Mm.
isn't known. One of her few surviving letters does say that marriage made her, quote, the happiest of women. My dear Hamilton is fonder of me every day. Okay. Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Philip, in 1782, which I think I will talk about him later on. Um, this would be the son that, though, that she did bury because he died in a duel.
Right.
And 7 more would follow over the next 2 decades.
Mm.
Lord, Lord. One of them she was pregnant with when he was having an affair. We'll talk about that later. Um,
Mm.
the Hamilton yeah, so the Hamiltons also raised the orphaned daughter of a friend for 10 years as well.
Wow.
Yeah. Um, A firm but affectionate mother, Elizabeth made sure her children had a religious upbringing and ran the household so efficiently that an associate told Hamilton that, quote, she has as much merit as your treasurer as you have as treasurer of the wealth of the United States. Because again, just to remind Mikel and everybody else, he
Mm.
was the treasurer of state um, under Washington. Um,
Mm.
She was present at such historic moments as when Hamilton began to write The Federalist and
Mhm.
composed his defense of a national bank.
Right.
Again, if you watch the show. Um, so Elizabeth also spent many months separated from her husband. During one such interlude in the summer of 1791, Hamilton began an affair with Maria Reynolds that when publicly revealed 6 years later, exposed Elizabeth to a humiliation augmented both by Hamilton's insistence on airing the adultery's most lurid details and a hostile press that asked, oh, quote, art thou wife? See him whom thou hast chosen for the partner of this life, lolling in the lap of a harlot, 'cause it's her fault her husband had an affair? Jesus, more on that later. Ashamed of his conduct, Hamilton began to pay closer attention to his family. Good to know.
Yep.
But a series of events would soon rip that family apart. So we're going into those losses now. The first blow was struck in March of 1801 when Elizabeth lost her sister Peggy after a long illness. We did talk about her last year. Her eldest son Philip died that November in a reckless duel, and Hamilton himself followed fewer than 3 years later with Aaron Burr. Thrust into harsh financial straits, Elizabeth then witnessed her father's death in November of 1804 and had to use both strength and ingenuity to keep her remaining family afloat.
Mm.
A slight inheritance from Philip Schuyler helped with that, as did the private raising of money from Hamilton's friends that enabled Elizabeth to stay in the house she and Hamilton had shared. So now we're going to kind of go into kind of what she did in her widowhood, which she did a lot.
Mm.
Elizabeth did not spend her days in sorrow or self pity. Instead, she immersed herself in charitable work, helping found New York's first private orphanage in 1806, and embarking on a decades long campaign to ensure, quote, her Hamilton received the historical laurels she was sure he deserved. She recruited biographers to do a proper work on her husband. The task eventually fell to a son, hired assistants to organize his papers, even wore a little bag around her neck with pieces of a sonnet he had composed for her in 1780.
Mm.
She moved to Washington, D.C. in 1848 to live with a daughter, became a celebrated guest at the White House, and died just a few months after her 97th birthday in a
Mm.
time where people did not survive that long. The other thing, too, that isn't mentioned in this article that is mentioned on the show, which I
Mhm.
think is kind of a disservice that's not mentioned here, is
Right.
she was also responsible for raising money for the Washington Monument as well.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this woman did so much. And to me, it kind of shows like no matter what is handed to you in life,
Mhm.
and then this poor woman not only lost a sister, lost her firstborn child, and like he was murdered, lost her husband only 3 years later, had to deal with an affair that was so public that hmm, really probably would have just slipped under the radar, never would have been known if it weren't for the fact that this man more concerned with his legacy, what people are going to think of him, what he can achieve in his life,
Mm.
and put it all out there, which we will talk about because I know maybe it sounds a little more confusing, but there's a
Right.
reason why it was put out there was because people were on to him
Mhm.
in terms of, well, I'll kind of say this part. Um, when he had the affair with Maria Reynolds, who was married, her husband found out and basically extorted money out of him. And they thought who the people who were on to him, which we'll talk about later, thought that he was taking money out of like taxpayers' money in a sense.
Right.
Like I don't know if that's how it worked back then, but in a sense, taxpayers' money when really it wasn't taxpayers' money, it was his money. So when that came out, he's like, "Oh damn it." So he is the reason anyone knew he had an affair. So because like she had to go through that too, it's like women are strong. We're strong. And to see a woman, especially back in those days, where we're supposed to be a little more submissive or subordinate or whatever
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
to our men, she just wasn't like that. And she, despite these trials and tribulations, just rose above it and lived a really long life. I think she's incredible. So,
Mhm.
so
Yeah.
that's Eliza Schuyler.
Mhm.
Okay, so we're gonna now do the second half of the episode. In the first half we talked about Eliza Schuyler. In this half, we're going to be talking about the woman in the center of the very first murder trial in American history. Mm. So we're gonna kind of go through there.
Okay.
From
Yeah.
from the jump, um, I'm gonna say that to find anything about this murder and not so much the trial per se, but the murder, any information on her, Elma Sands, that's her name, um, was very difficult, which is why we actually had to pause, let me listen to a podcast and come back in. Um, and I will have an answer for that because there actually is an answer for why there's very little known about Elma Sands, about the murder, about really anything following the trial, and it's actually very angering, even more so, but
Mm.
we'll get to that. So to start off, the infamous Manhattan Well murder, which, by the way, the Manhattan Well still exists. I think it's actually located in a basement of like a store or boutique in Manhattan. Um, it became the first sensationalized U.S. murder trial in 1800. She was murdered in 1799. Um, and which we will be talking about the new podcast. Well, not new, it's actually a couple years old now, but the podcast Erased is kind of now putting that focus on Elma Sands, who was 22 years old,
Mm.
and found dead at the bottom of the well. So Levi Weeks, who was Elma's, well, lover, fiance, it's murky on where they kind of stood, was tried for and then acquitted, so we'll get into it, of her murder. His legal team comprised of the most famous pair of legal rivals in U.S. history, and that was Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr.
Mm.
Right.
Well,
So Elma's full name is Guli Elma, aka Elma Sands. So just a little bit of the background that I could find. Disappeared on the evening of December 22nd in 1799. Before leaving her boarding house that evening, Elma told her cousin Catherine Sands, who actually owned this boarding house with her husband, that she was to be secretly married that night to the man who had been courting her, which was Levi Weeks. A few days after Elma Sands vanished, a young boy found the muff, which I will describe what a muff is in a second. Um, she had been wearing in the Manhattan Well, so actually in the well. On January 2nd, 1800, Sand's body was recovered from that well, and while there was speculation at the time that she may have been pregnant, so the old age motive for some men, this was later disproved by medical evidence. Shortly afterward, a grand jury indicted Levi Weeks for the murder of Elma Sands. So in case you don't know the terminology, a grand jury just basically means that they present some of the evidence that they have to, against a defendant potentially. And that grand jury is going to decide whether to um, go through with charges or not. So it's not actually a trial. Um, so Levi Weeks was the brother of Ezra Weeks, which we will briefly talk about a little bit because I think there is some potential involvement with him. A prominent citizen, and through his brother's wealth and connections, Weeks retained three of New York's most prominent attorneys, which we don't hear much about, was Henry Brockholst Livingston, Aaron Burr, and Alexander Hamilton to represent him at the trial. The court consisted of three judges, which was Chief Justice John Lansing Jr., Mayor Richard Harrison, and Recorder Richard Varick. So the recorder might be the court reporter, which they say in the podcast. This trial was one of the if not the first trial that actually had court transcripts,
mm.
which is how we know anything, honestly. Um, And what's really amazing about the podcast, which we will link to in the show notes,
Right.
um, is that they reenact the trial, it was 2 days long. They reenact it in modern day lingo, obviously, because 2 centuries ago is you may not necessarily understand everything, but it's actually really well done. Um, so that's maybe the reason why we know anything. Um, the prosecutor was Assistant Attorney General and future Mayor of New York, Cadwallader David Colden. The trial, the first recorded murder trial in the United States, took place on March 31st and April 1st, 1800. The state's case was entirely circumstantial, which, yes, but I think what's actually been like really sad, especially in true crime podcasts, though at least for me, I've heard in the last maybe a year or two, circumstantial evidence is also evidence. You can you can convict a person on circumstantial evidence.
Yeah. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, so and I mean, we'll go through it as much as I can, but I mean, the evidence they had against him, like there's no way this man didn't do it. We'll get into it in a minute, but
Right.
um so yeah, circumstantial evidence and the defense produced witnesses who testified that Levi was in the company of his brother Ezra, which means nothing, and other friends during the evening in question. That's not true.
Hmm.
Chief Justice Lansing instructed the jury that there was not sufficient proof against Levi Weeks to warrant a decision against him, but he stopped short of a directed verdict. The jury deliberating for only 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Like, now this is 1800, so things I'm sure were different, but I mean, in today's world, that would never happen. But we'll say it this way. 5 minutes then is the equivalent of like an hour today, which like an hour is not that long. An hour
Really?
is, yeah, it's not that long because what they, again, I've never been on a jury, but what from my understanding is
Mm-hmm.
when they do a jury, anything that's like 45 minutes to an hour is very short and probably not good for defense. Because they have to go through the charging order. They have to go through, you know, here's your instructions, which can take time. And then also then from that point, you have to then have a vote, guilty or not guilty. That
Hmm.
doesn't take a long time. Or it doesn't take a long time. So if you're literally like doing that and you're coming back, because it also once you make your decision, you then have to tell a court official, we've come to a decision, file everybody back in. And that an hour is not that long. And it's not that long. But it's
Hmm.
that's yeah. In those terms, it's not that long. So me hearing 5 minutes is like the equivalent of an hour in today's world. Because I probably didn't go through all of that stuff before, like, back then. But yeah, so not very long. The jury deliberating for only 5 minutes acquitted Weeks of the crime, although the state had failed to establish its case and Judge Lansing's instruction was proper, his charge to the jury was widely criticized. The public strongly disagreed with the verdict, and Weeks was generally ostracized, forcing him to leave New York. So Levi Weeks eventually settled in Natchez, Mississippi, where he became a well-respected architect and builder. So that's what he had to do. And again, in those days, you could go from state to state and potentially start a new life, which is sure in some cases you can still do that today. But something like this, I feel would have been more nationwide, and you probably wouldn't have been able to get away with moving from one state to the next and then not follow you. Um, so like mentioned, I was gonna describe what a muff is, just in case you can't visualize, which is something we don't really see today. It's basically just a tube made of fur or other warm material into which the hands are placed for warmth. So it's like gloves, but it's a little tube thing. Um, so we're gonna go into just a little bit of the podcast now. This is gonna be the really like compressed version. There's so much with this podcast, which is why I'm going to say if this is interesting to you at all, you want to learn more, go listen to the podcast. It's incredible. I've listened to it twice now. Um, it's really well done podcast.
Is it more of a crime podcast or is it more of a like a
Well, I mean, you're talking about, theories and of this murder and because they obviously didn't know exactly what
Mhm.
happened, or let me rephrase that. A coroner or something of the like, which we'll get to,
Mhm.
um, basically said she was murdered. She based on the wounds, based on everything, they classified her case as a murder.
Right.
But defense try to switch that around. So no, you are going to be hearing those things, but it's literally a reenactment of the trial.
Mm,
So that's basically what it is. Because they were able to, which I'm assuming the transcripts of this case is
mm,
readily available, whether you go to mine, library, I don't know, but I'm assuming it's pretty readily available. Or if you go to maybe even New York, if you were to go to, I don't know if the courthouse still exists that they did this, I don't know, but you might be able to find it there. But it's just a reenactment of the trial. But you're gonna hear things. So just as a warning, if you don't want to hear certain things, um, then don't, I guess, listen to it. Um, but yeah. So
okay. Cool, cool.
yeah. So basically, before we kind of get into it, I have to say, I don't know how I didn't catch this the first time that I listened to it. Maybe it's because Scandal was more fresh in my mind, and when I heard the voice again, I'm like, oh, like I didn't know he was voicing, but um Tony Goldwyn, who plays Fitz in Scandal. I mean, I say that, but he's been in so many other things. Um he voices Alexander Hamilton, and I'm like, oh, I know that voice. But yeah, so that was pretty cool. But there's like reputable people, actors and stuff who voiced in this podcast, so that's pretty cool. Um, but let's get to this a little bit of the key things that kind of happened during the trial. That
Mhm.
the reason why I talk about this, because obviously, like, it doesn't, bode well for women when this is happening to us. But I think it opens your eyes to how women were viewed then, and really how that hasn't changed much. And I think we need to do so much better because this poor girl, she was a baby. She was 22 years old. Life is taken away from her. She's believing this who is promising her the world. And just it's horrible. And I think I think unfortunately her name has really just gone under the radar, and I want to bring it back out there because I think it's unfair to her. So yeah, the biggest thing with this trial, which we talked about, the assistant prosecutor, who then became mayor of New York. He was very inexperienced at the time that he tried this murder case, um, which I think maybe unfortunately did not bode well for Elma Sands and her family and her friends. And it was kind of said at one point in the podcast that, he would try murder trials after that. Then he was getting wins, he was getting more experienced. And kind of wondered if he were to have tried her case later on in his career, if it would have given a different answer when you're kind of going against, let's be real, these heavyweights that is Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, um, who are, were involved in the politics, were great lawyers. I mean, I think really and truly the two of them, but especially Alexander Hamilton, really shaped what became, you know, the law really, and how you try cases. So he didn't stand a chance, unfortunately. But it's kind of like, maybe if he had a little more time, maybe he could have done it. Um, his opening statement, was kind of painting her in a good light, not in all intents and purposes shaming her. And obviously kind of painting Levi as this monster that he probably was. Um, so and again, how they did trials was very different. The prosecutor would do his opening statement and then would present his case, and then defense would do their opening, present their case. So it was a little different. They nowadays usually both counsel do their opening, and then each side presents their case after. So a little
Right,
different.
right.
Um, so we talked about, yeah, Elma lived in the boarding house that was owned by her cousin and her husband, Catherine Ring. I can't remember her husband's name, but um, Catherine Ring was the first person to go on the stand. And the biggest thing too, like this was like like this is skeptical. It's like this would never happen today. But you have Catherine's husband out in the crowd yelling different things to his wife to say, and it's all being recorded, which also would not happen. It would literally be like, you're not a part of this. You're not on the stand right now. Shut up. Like, and he's just yelling things, which I think like didn't help. Like maybe don't do that. They actually had to remove him, but he would find his way in and out of the courtroom after that. And it's like, again, like, who is this helping? This isn't helping Alma's case give her justice. Like, this isn't helping. Um, so the defense basically tried, which is, what they do, diminish her credibility. Um, said that it was hearsay, that she, when it came about the marriage part of it, because that was the biggest thing. What I need to stress here is Alma Sands was kind of seen as low class, not good enough for someone like Levi Weeks. Um, and him proposing marriage to a person who was quote unquote beneath him, would have not maybe bode well for him. So they're literally trying to say, well, Alma's saying that they were going to get married is hearsay. But, well, of course it is, because if he's not going to say it, which of course he's not, Alma's not here to speak for herself. So it's just like,
Mhm,
it's not hearsay. It's
mhm,
what she witnessed. She's a witness. She's a
mhm,
witness to what was said. Like, I, I, I can understand how you would consider that hearsay. I understand. But it's like, someone has to speak for her. Who else is going to speak for her? Because Levi's not doing it. He's trying to pretend like nothing happened, or at least wasn't as serious as it was. But um, so just kind of the details of what Catherine, her cousin, said happened that night that she disappeared. So Levi and Elma apparently left on the night of the murder around 8:10 p.m. And she claimed to hear like this whispering between the two of them. Doesn't know exactly what they said, but said that they were whispering and figured it was Levi and or no, also I'm getting confused. She was hearing whispering, didn't know who it was, but she assumed it was Levi and somebody
mhm,
else.
mhm,
Um, so he left with her. I need to stress this. He left with Elma and then came back home because he lived in the boarding house, came back home without her. Where did she go? Why are you coming home without her? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
mm,
You were then, and again, the last person to see her alive. That's just how this works.
mhm,
Um, when Catherine questioned him about where Alma was, because again, there was a curfew. I think the curfew was 10 p.m. So you have to be home by a certain time. So when she questioned him, he said he looked pale, like he was hiding something. Now, in today's world, as much as it's hard, you try not to criticize someone's demeanor because everyone presents differently. But it's like something in this situation where we don't know she's dead. We don't know what's happened to her. Why you look like that? What's wrong with you? You know? That's how I would think, anyways. The next day when she said, um, oh, like you guys are married now because that's what Elma told her that they were going to do. He
mhm,
says, what? No, I didn't marry her. Okay, sir, then where is she? You're claiming you didn't marry her. You come home without her when she figures y'all supposed to be getting married. Where is she?
mm,
Um, and he actually would use this terminology, she's beneath me. Let me be very clear. No one's beneath anybody. Okay. This is again the thing of I'm good enough for you to have sex with,
Mm.
but I'm beneath you when it comes to marrying me. Like, and again, I know it's the times, but it's just like
Do you
that's
feel
that's
do you feel this person must be embarrassed?
yes,
Yeah.
100%, 100%.
Yeah.
He's embarrassed. I think because again, he had his brother Ezra, who
Right.
I think Ezra was the older brother, and I think like he has a lot to prove. So being with someone who is a Quaker, which I don't fully know what the meaning of Quaker is, but I know it's kind of like seen as not good enough. Um, she comes from a family of Quakers. I'm not sure if she was particularly Quaker, but I think she comes from a family of Quakers. She is this young girl. She um, is in high society or even middle class society.
Mm.
So yes, he would have been embarrassed by her. But then don't like why would you because I'm sorry, I believe you promised marriage. If she's beneath you, why did you marry her or say you want to marry her? Because now it feels like it's planned. Now it feels like you were trying to get her off of you. Maybe she did think she was pregnant. And maybe that's why he said, okay, let's get married. And maybe this was his way out of doing that. But it's weird to me. Like you could have just not done any of that. You could continue to having sex with her. That's what you wanted to do until you find someone who is of your caliber, quote unquote, and be done with it. Why did it have to come to this? Like it just doesn't make sense. Um, so yeah, he would say, "Oh, she's just an orphan." Like he's really like being an and he apparently yelled and cried that I'm ruined. She heard him say that. So again, why what first of all, A, she hasn't been found yet. She's still considered missing. Why are you saying you're gonna be ruined? Why? What happened? Why do you feel that way? Men. So then we kind of hear about this guy named Richard Croucher, who was another boarder. He's kind of controversial. I'll get into why at the end.
Right.
Um, but let's just say he's he like I don't think he did anything to her. I don't
Is
think.
is he a
Hmm?
little bit dramatic? Is he offensive? Is he
Okay, so I'll just kind of
violent?
I'll
No,
look into
just
it.
yeah.
Basically, he was kind of seen as a person who was getting involved with very young girls, like potentially like
Oh, okay, so
children.
okay.
Um, and then he was eventually executed in England for I can't remember what it was, but maybe I'll find it later. But he was executed in England like 9 years after her murder, or 7 years after her murder. I can't remember,
Right.
but yeah, like he was problematic to say the
Mm-hmm.
least, which again, in today's society, your
Mm-hmm.
credibility is murky if you don't have any credibility, basically. When you have someone like that on the stand. So,
Mm. Okay.
first of all, I'm going to say too, Levi Weeks never goes on the stand. We never hear from
Right.
him.
Right.
He
Right.
never speaks for himself.
Right.
Um, so then we kind of question then with Levi, was like what time he was kind of sleeping to the next day after she's been gone. Um, he apparently slept until the fourth night after her disappearance. So 1, 2, 3, 4 days he slept after her disappearance. Why are you sleeping? And who sleeps for 4 days straight? Like who does that? Did you eat? Did you anything? Like you're just sleeping for 4 days? Again, feels like you're hiding something. That's just me though. Um, and after it was announced that she had disappeared, he started freaking out about her because, yeah. Um, and then I think at one point we referred to her body or referred to her as the quote unquote body, which again, I'm going to go kind of back and forth here with then and today and the similarities with it. When someone uses terminology like the body or her, him, them, not using their name, it's you trying to distance yourself from the situation, not because it's uncomfortable, but because you probably did something. You are someone you have to be probably involved in what happened to that person. So then at that point, Levi suggests, so maybe she committed suicide. Wait, what? First of all, okay, wait. You left with her that
Mhm.
night at 8:10 p.m., come home without her. When did the potential suicide happen? When did that happen? Did you what? Like, I feel like again, like I'm not saying that it couldn't have happened, but when I am, and again, I feel like if someone is going to commit suicide, especially as women, statistically speaking, we don't do things like that. We tend to poison even ourselves. Even that's usually mode of death too, murder. But we also do it to ourselves. We don't want to do traumatic things like that to ourselves. Men tend to do things like that. Like I don't know. Like I don't think we have a lot of wells these days that people are potentially falling into or whatever, or
Mhm.
purposely falling
Mhm.
into.
Mhm.
So I don't know, but it's just weird that like you left with this everyone saw you leave with her.
Mhm.
And then she commits like you leave her while she hurts herself. Like that just doesn't make sense.
Right.
So defense counsel believed because she was, and I quote, promiscuous, she was suicidal. So I'm not gonna hate on Aaron Burr because as far as we
Mhm.
know, he's not a like a cheater or anything like that. But
Right.
Mr. Hamilton, you're dead. You're not listening. But Mr. Hamilton, you want to come at people, women, anyone for being quote unquote promiscuous, yet you were having an affair behind your wife's back? Get all the way. Like, are you kidding? And again, so, I'm sorry, but women being sexual, being comfortable with their sexuality,
Mhm.
we want to commit suicide? Like, that doesn't,
That doesn't make any sense.
of course, it doesn't make any sense. But again, this was the times. So, of course, any woman who's unwed and
Right.
having sex, like, she's
Mhm.
having a miserable life.
Yeah.
No, actually, I think she's having a really great life because she is getting off. Like, ah, sex really, you release happy hormones. So I'm confused. But of course, they didn't know that. Whatever. I don't know. Maybe they did. I don't know. Um, so then at this point, her uncle, um, they were trying to say that because he was her guardian, which again, this was the terminology they use. If you're unwed, you need to have a guardian, whatever. It's her fault. It's his fault that she committed suicide. So they're basically trying to like defense's strategy is, well, you were her guardian. Levi Weeks isn't responsible. It's you. You're responsible because you're supposed to take care of her. Okay. Um. So then the defense is kind of like, to her uncle. Well, where
Mhm.
did you look for her? Which I don't know the reason for asking this question and why no like why didn't the prosecutor say relevance? Like what is happening here?
Mhm.
Like where did you look in the river? And they're like I think he kind of said he did, and they're like, "Well, why would you look there? Because if
Right.
you're looking for a live person, why would you need to look in the river?" Because in his mind, he's like, "I was look," or sorry, I think I'm getting confused. He questioned whether or not he looked in the river, like, because if you're thinking she's dead, then you'd be looking for a corpse. So why wouldn't you look in the river? And her uncle's like, I wasn't looking for a corpse. I was looking for an alive Elma because I'm not thinking. Because again, we can't put ourselves there.
Hmm.
You have to constantly have the hope of they're alive, they're well. So no, that's just not human nature to do stuff like that. So then we have this woman named Miss Leons, and she
Hmm.
claimed that she saw Elma
Hmm.
the day of her murder or night of her murder, and then not long after that, I believe that she heard Elma screaming,
Hmm.
"Help me," and screaming, "Murder." Like she was trying to say, there's about to be a murder, or there is a murder, or I'm about to get murdered. Like that's what she heard. And she's adamant that that's what she heard, and it was Elma because she knew her voice. So so I will say, if you do decide to listen to the podcast, that is something you will hear periodically throughout the episodes. It can be a little distressing, but again, we really don't know if she did that, but based on just witness, that's what she heard. So, yeah, so then another witness says they heard violence, and Hamilton's like, "Well, why didn't you help them?" Because again, unfortunately, it's kind of like, what would you do situation. Human nature is to not get involved because we don't know what dangers we could potentially be putting ourselves in. Um, and that witness literally says, "Well, that's not my job to stop it. That's someone else's job to stop it. Police, something." It's like, if I put myself in that danger, then maybe I'll end up the same way as that person. That's it's unfortunate, but that is just human nature. Unfortunately, there was a lot of people who heard things and didn't help her or couldn't help her or whatever the case may be. And again, there was another witness, which I won't go too much into, but there was another witness that kind of was saying it was really dark. Because I think again, we look at today's world and we're like, oh, it's never too dark. But imagine if those street lights were off. That's how it was then. So you might not even be able to see anything in front of your face, you know? That was the whole thing with Jack the Ripper as well. So another witness, this was interesting, claimed they witnessed the murder, which again, I don't know how you would have, but maybe possible. That they basically saw a man pacing after pushing a woman into the the well. And Levi Weeks was known to be a nervous pacer. Now, it's not enough, but just interesting. Because again, I'm of the stance of he did it, and it's unfortunate that he's no longer alive to deal with that. But and he got away with it, but I believe he did it. So okay, so then there was the whole thing about a horse carriage. Um, and he didn't own a horse carriage, but Ezra Weeks did. And someone apparently witnessed Ezra Weeks' horse carriage leaving the wherever it was stored on the night of the murder,
Right.
basically trying to make it look like Levi probably took it. And Ezra's aware, whether he knew it was because of what he was going to do. I don't know if he knew, whatever, but um, someone took it. So that was another thing. Again, they say circumstantial, but I personally think like this is some heavy hitting stuff. Like, of course, anything back then would have been circumstantial. They didn't have DNA in the same way we do now. They probably wouldn't have even thought to collect DNA at the time. Um, so it's like, yeah, anything that's not linking somebody based on their DNA, It's considered circumstantial evidence. I don't, okay. Um, the other thing that happened, which, I mean, I don't know, I think this is incorrect. This shouldn't have happened, but again, in the 1800s of it all, Catherine Ring displayed Elma's body for everyone to see, to, I guess, maybe show what happened to her and to kind of say, like, this person who did this to her needs to pay the consequences. But what ended up happening was decontamination. Um, Everyone is seeing how she looked and can maybe construe things differently or whatever. It just was a bad idea. Um, I understand why. So another twist that I think is the reason why we had Aaron Burr in particular. I can't speak on Alexander Hamilton, but Aaron Burr basically owned the site where Elma Sands was found, which is probably why he was his lawyer, or like Levi Weeks' lawyer at all. Um, and Ezra Weeks, his brother, was the one who built the Manhattan Well. So there's this connection, which again, that's nothing wrong with that, I guess. But it's just interesting that like that's where the connection lies. I don't know, it just feels fishy. But anyways, a man named Aaron Blank, he was one of, I don't know if he was the only one, but one of the men who got her out of the well. He mentioned that her stockings were torn, like she was potentially dragged, and her dress was ripped open, exposing her breasts and her stomach. So basically trying to make it seem like she was dragged and then potentially like shoved into the well post mortem, which I don't know, maybe. Um, so they say like how could that be a suicide? If she committed suicide, her stockings would have been torn, her dress would have been ripped open. Like those things wouldn't have happened. She would have just, as she was, gone into the well. So just another thing that doesn't make sense. Um, so basically, again, I think because another one reason why things just didn't bode well for her justice was that they did the first day of the court trial of the trial for 14 hours, which does not happen. Trial goes through a regular 9 to 5 type situation. Usually starts at 10 a.m., finished by 5 p.m. Um, and it was 2:30 in the morning, and defense did not want the adjournment because we're winning. So why would we want to adjourn now and go to recess? So, um, but it's like 2:30 in the morning, my guys. Like,
Mhm.
does no one sleep? Okay, so a neighbor who apparently lived beside, this is the next day now, a neighbor who lived beside the boarding house used the terminology that he heard Elias Ring, which is her uncle, or or technically her cousin's husband, heard him quote unquote ruining Alma. So like involved with her sexually. I don't know how you can tell that, but he claimed he knew Elias's voice. So that's how he knows it was him. Again, don't know how you can tell that through a wall. Unless she's saying his name. Don't know how you know that. But they're basically trying to take the heat off of Levi and basically paint this picture of, well, these are the reasons why she committed suicide. Um, which is gross. So I mentioned earlier about the whole coroner situation of it all. they weren't coroners. Not they like I think the person who deemed her demise as a murder was a dentist. And they used that against the prosecution, defense did, which I don't know. I can't speak to it because it was 1800s, so like I don't know
Mhm.
if that's like typical, but it's just interesting because I feel like this is things you just don't like a dentist shouldn't be saying whether or not someone was murdered or not. Like it's just that doesn't happen. Yeah, someone would say that she was a harlot and a druggie. She was using something called laudanum, which I don't know if that's something that you can get access to nowadays. I guess it was kind of like a hallucinogenic, I think. I'm not sure. Um, but they said that she was on this laudanum. Um, again, though, those aren't reasons to claim that she hurt herself. And I question if the tables were turned and it was Levi who was the one that was murdered, they wouldn't have ever done any of this. They would have prosecuted the case. He probably would have gotten justice. He wouldn't have been seen as a harlot or promiscuous or a druggie or any of those things.
Right.
But as a woman and a young woman, she was, those terminologies were used. And unfortunately, I think with it, anyone that's been quote unquote in a marginalized like group, and I hate to kind of use women as a marginalized group, but in a way we kind of are in this case anyways, we're always othered. If you are dealing with, which we've talked about, like Matthew Shepard, for example, I guarantee his murderers tried to use the gay defense. Well, he was gay. He came on to me, so I had to kill him. No, you didn't. And again, because a person is gay does not mean they automatically want to have sex with you. Like that's just not realistic. Same with women. Just because we are women who may like to have sex or are a little more free with our lives and whatever, um, doesn't classify a reason for us to be murdered. And I think that's part of it for me with this case is like, God, even like when I heard about this in the Broadway show and them talking about the first murder trial of American history, I wasn't expecting this. And it's pretty angering to kind of, and not hating on Lin-Manuel Miranda or anything like that,
Mhm.
but it's it's frustrating to kind of know, okay, so the first murder trial, recorded murder trial of American history
Mm.
is this. And he got away with it.
Wow.
So frustrating.
Yeah.
So, yeah, this kind of fast forwarding a little bit, like I said, there's so much information with this podcast. I implore just go over there and listen to it. You'll kind of
Mhm.
get everything. Yes, it's reenactments, but you get all of the information. It's just too much to do in this episode. But
Mm.
um the thing that I mentioned earlier, which was it made a mention at the end of episode 6, it's 6 episodes. The reason that we don't have the information on her about her life, about the murder, the trial, Levi Weeks. Like, I don't even know if he got remarried. I don't know if he got to live out his life. I don't know anything. The reason why? Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton is the reason why we know nothing. Because he had any reporting on this case was basically hidden away. Like it's like it doesn't exist. So, and listen, I jam to Hamilton like everybody else. But every time you listen to Alexander Hamilton, the actual song, Alexander Hamilton, and you hear all of the accomplishments this man achieved when he really probably should have died when he was 9 years old or whatever it was. It's fantastic. But with that, he used that power for his own reasons, his own selfish
Mhm.
reasons. And that part for me is what's angering.
Yeah.
Because I guarantee if it wasn't for, because again, they don't even say her name. So I'm gonna hate on Lin-Manuel Miranda for a second here. He doesn't even say her name. So if it wasn't for this podcast erased, we probably wouldn't know her name. So
Mm.
don't forget her name. Alma Sands.
Okay. All right. Great episode. So this ends this episode of the Next Tape podcast. The Next Tape podcast is available now on all podcast platforms. We also have a website called Tanika,
Next take podcast.podpage.io. Links in the show notes.
and we're also available at Tanika.
We're on Facebook and Instagram at Next Take Podcast, Twitter and TikTok at Next Take Pod, and we're also on Blue Sky. I think it's Next Take Pod
Yeah.
as well.
Okay. And you can contact us in an email at mikeltanika@gmail.com. That is mikeltanika@gmail.com. So Tanika uh, did a whole entire episode based on, or second part based on, Don't Forget Her Name. What's her
Elma
name, Tanika?
Sands.
Elma
Elma
Sands.
Sands. Yeah, the first part was Eliza Schuyler.
Okay.
So people surrounding Alexander Hamilton
Mm-hmm.
that I think are, for me anyways,
Okay.
more memorable than him.
Right. Okay. All right. Hope you all enjoyed the episode. This is Mikel, and
Before we finish out, before we close
okay,
out, I just wanted
go
to
ahead.
say we are in the middle of Women's History Month.
Yeah, yeah.
So just two different things here. So Women's History Month, we're coming in with a second episode on the 13th. There will be a bonus episode the day before. Um, Not so much women's history focused, but um we're gonna be talking about the fall of Diddy documentary, kind of doing some points on that. And then also with this episode, it is technically, yes, it's a part of Women's History Month, but it is technically a little bit of like a mini series, like the Hamilton mini series. So we're kind of scattering them around this year. The next one is going to be on April 10th.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So you can look out for that.
Okay. Look out for those coming soon. And yeah, that should be awesome.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm Mikel, and
And I'm Tanyka.
we'll be back until
Well, next week.
next week. All right.
Yeah.
Next week. Peace, guys.
Bye.